The Zionist movement realized that Britain, after World War II, even if they won, would never be a great empire again. In her book, Western Crime, Viviane Forrester says that all of Europe was in crisis during war, to the point that each country reduced the number of Jews refugees displaced to it and created what she called the Hitler trap. Hear that? European countries refused to give refuge to the Jews, outright leaving them to the Holocaust. The Zionist movement was aware of that situation and realized if it needed a trustworthy ally, a new ally instead of Britain, then that ally has to be outside of Europe, specifically the United States of America. In 1942, Zionists held the Baltimore Conference to gather supporters of Zionism in the US. Among its recommendations was that the new world born after the war would have the Jewish state as a part of it, which had its arms wide open to all the Jews of the world. That's when the Zionist movement was trying to have a role in the interests of the world's greatest empires. It presented itself as an ideal solution for the surplus of Jews in Europe. It also presented itself as a new ally to the single power that wasn't affected by war. That's when we ask, while the US was in the midst of the Second World War, why did it accept the role of the new sponsor? Honestly, like I told you before, the US is country that can understand the Zionist dream the most. In her diary, Hard Choices, the cunt Hillary Clinton says that the American people are mostly immigrants who fled their countries to a dream in a faraway country. Hillary says, in Israel's story we see our own. It's true that the Americans won't be the holy and chosen people, but at least they will be its allies, who will help that people fulfill the dream they once achieved before, that's in addition to America's interests in having an ally like Israel in a region like the Middle East. And as long as we have the same dream and animalistic mindset, so we can say it's a win-win situation. And indeed, the new alliance was forged between the Zionist movement and the US, who started to fund them generously, to the point that the Haganah would have its own armament factories. Of course, the British saw that and were shocked. They realized that the historic agreement between the British and Zionists was one-sided. It was like a one-sided love, a toxic relationship. Britain kept on giving, giving, and giving. Then you dumped me for the US, even when I needed you during World War II and asked you to please limit the Jewish immigrations because the Arabs keep nagging me. What did you do? And what about Stern, who met the Nazis? What's going on? Britain broke down. Britain was investing a lot in the Zionist project to have an entity that serves their interests in the region, only to realize later that this wasn't an option in the Zionist plans. Britain was raising a monster, nurturing it and making it stronger, thinking that it has the monster's shackles in its hands. But when Britain checked on the chain, it didn't find its monster. The monster of its own creation was leading at the time some of the most violent waves of terrorism. Against who? The British themselves. In 1946, the Irgun gang blew up the King David Hotel, the British administration headquarters. They bombed it with almost 200 kgs of explosives and killed 91 British persons. In 1947, the Irgun bombed the British Officers' Club in Jerusalem. Then a ship named Exodus would arrive in Palestine carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors who wanted to enter Palestine. But the British refused to let them in, saying, "Guys, this exceeds the allowed limit." Then they deported the ship back to France. This ignited riots, resulting in the execution of 3 of the Irgun members. So the Irgun kidnapped 2 British soldiers and hung them dead in groves near Netanya. For that to be a clear message to the British, leave, we no longer need you. The paradox is that the Irgun leader, who was listed as wanted by the British police, who do you think that was? He was Menachem Begin. The irony here is that Menachem Begin, who would later be Israel's prime minister and who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, used to be considered a terrorist by Britain. Just casually like that. Imagine this motherfucker classified by Britain as a terrorist became years later a Nobel laureate for peace. During the final years of the British Mandate, 500 terrorist attacks by the Zionists in Palestine were documented, killing more than 169 British soldiers, targeting banks and infrastructure, and using methods of terrorism that were new to the world. Like what? Like parcel bombs? Putting a bomb in a parcel, sending it to someone, then it blows him up. Terrorism delivery. That's the innovation in terrorism. My dear viewer, these attacks impacted Britain in the form of a retaliatory attack on 300 Jewish facilities in England. And even more than that, raising the Nazi swastika that urges the extermination of Jews. We are talking about England only 2 years post-World War II against Nazis. The British raised Nazi flags and slogans. Guys, calm down. You shouldn't do that. You might think that the paradoxes are over, but no. The British forces of 75,000 soldiers in Palestine at the time won't take any action against the Zionist gangs. They actually arrested over 300 Palestinians on charges of carrying a weapon. Guys, are you blind? It wasn't us. The Israeli historian Avi Shlaim pointed at this paradox and said that the British mandate bears the moral burden of opposing and precluding the establishment of a Palestinian state till the very last minute. Until 1947, when Britain decides that this is it, they won't lose another soldier in the conflict. So they tossed it to the United Nations and said, "You solve this issue, I've had enough." Eugene Rogan, an English historian, says something very surreal, that the country that says it fights terrorism the most ousted the British using terrorism. Again, I'm not the one saying that, it's Mr. Eugene. The United Nations issued the Partition Resolution 181, dividing it into 6 regions, 3 Arab regions and 3 Jewish ones, with Jerusalem under international supervision. 56% of the land would go to the Jewish country. Most of the land would go to the Jews, even though the Palestinian population was double that of the Jews. In 1947, Palestinian population was 1,200,000, and Jewish population was 600,000. Palestinians legally owned, and note this, 94% of the land and 80% of the agricultural land. So, larger population, more land ownership, yet eventually, 56% of the land was given to the minority after this partition, who, before that partition, only owned 6% of the land. The partition gave Zionists bigger areas, but it couldn't give them ethnically homogeneous cities. It gave them cities like Jaffa and Haifa, which were mostly populated by Arabs. The historian Ilan Pappé said that no one in the world could have imagined that a national liberation movement in Palestine would share the land with its settlers. However, remember that the main goal of Zionism was for the Jews to not live with others that differ from them. And remember that the Zionist dream grew from a country in a part of Palestine to the entirety of Palestine. When General Darcy was asked about the land situation in Palestine, he said that after Britain's withdrawal, the Jewish Agency controlled all of Palestine. The Haganah was an organized military group of 35,000 soldiers. The Palmach commands were more than 10,000 soldiers. Ergen and Stern were big and organized military groups with experience. Meanwhile, the Arab front was far from being systematic or organized. The Arab countries had just survived war, and an occupation that they hadn't recovered from yet, with exhausted armies and conflicted interests. The Arab countries opened the doors for volunteering to save Palestine, to have an improvised army of 4,000 volunteers. That army was called the Arab Liberation Army. Despite the loyalty of its members, it still was an unorganized army. Even in Palestine, Ilan Pappé said that efforts were scattered instead of united between leaders like Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, Fawzi al-Kaji, and Hassan Salama, who carried out separate operations. That wouldn't have that much of an effect. All of these were Arab and Palestinian attempts to reject the division. But on the Zionist side, a more dangerous matter was taking place. Remember, the declaration of Israel hasn't been announced yet. Neither has the 1948 war taken place. We are currently at the end of 1947, where Haganah meetings were held intensifying their operations. Do you remember the Villages Project? The one where they collected information about all Palestinian villages? This project transformed into the famous plan called Plan Dalet, a complete ethnic cleansing plan on paper ready to go. However, it needs a real trial, a rehearsal. The rehearsal takes place on February 15th in 1948. When the Palmach leader Yitzhak Rabin, another animal who was awarded a Nobel Prize for Peace also, by the way, led an attack on the village of Caesarea in Haifa district, expelling 1,500 of its inhabitants. The Zionists attacked 5 villages to ensure the efficiency of their fighters, and to make sure that the remaining of the British soldiers who haven't left yet won't intervene. The gangs start an organized attack on the villages surrounding Jerusalem. Someone asks, wasn't Jerusalem not a part of the partitioned areas? I just saw that map you showed me. You know, my friend, David Ben-Gurion was once asked about Israel's borders. He then said the best definition for Israel's borders is the farthest place that the Israeli soldiers can get to. Since the beginning of the Zionist movement, it was movement that takes a piece of land and keeps expanding. I mean, why commit to borders that weren't set when we arrived? We're the ones who set those borders, and those borders are created and changed every day. We previously had 6%, now we have 55%. And if we move a bit, who knows what's next? Either way, with the right force, the world will accept it as a fact. This ideology controlled the Zionist movement from its birth till this very moment. In the beginning, the strategy was besieging every village they encounter from 3 sides, leaving only one exit for the villagers to leave and become refugees elsewhere. Where would they refuge? It's their problem. However, sometimes these animals would need to show off their power by leaving no exit for escape and make it as a game literally. Exactly like what happened in Deir Yassin. In Deir Yassin on April 9, 1948. Deir Yassin was a tranquil village inhabited by 700 residents. It had farmers, merchants, a mosque, 2 schools and a sports club. In only one day, 250 people were murdered, almost a third of the village. Each person would see his family die in front of his eyes, knowing that he's next. Despite the fact that the British police office was only 3 km away, none of them did anything. A terrorist demonstration. This demonstration would forcibly push 75,000 Palestinians to leave their homes in Jaffa, Haifa and Jerusalem and run away. The ethnic cleansing doesn't stop at expulsion and eradication, but also, as we have seen in the first story, it means erasing any memory of that place, as if those victims were never here. 1 kilometer away from Deir Yassin, the Yad Vashem was built. For the paradox of it, what did that turn out to be? It's a Holocaust museum, proving the famous words by Emil Habibi, "Your Holocaust, our catastrophe." While gangs were seizing villages by force and terrorism, the British Mandate handed over the ports to the Jews as it left. They also handed them over around 2,700 government buildings, 50 train stations, 3,000 km of roads, and 37 camps equipped with weapons and their spare parts. The British literally built the Zionists a country and left. According to the Zionist narrative, the crisis of the Palestinian refugees was caused by Arab armies calling citizens to move in preparation for armies to enter. However, the historian Ilan Pape says that half the Palestinian refugees were expelled from homes before the war started. They were expelled before May 1948, before the Arab armies even set foot. Among the 500 villages destroyed in the Nakba, half of them were ethnically cleansed. Again, all that was before May 1948. The historian Avi Schleim confirms that the refugee crisis commenced during the first half of 1948, but was not caused by the war itself. And after animalistic, terroristic operations and over and armless men, women, kids, old people, On May the 14th, 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel was announced. On May the 14th, 1948, the State of Israel was establishment and announced. And as part of their narrative, Israel announced itself as a young David in front of a giant Goliath. And by the way, David the prophet is actually Dawood, which Muslim prophet exactly like Jesus. Search in the Quran and you will find a lot about the history of children of Israel. They are hypocrites, liars and killers since day one and never been the Muslims. I guess we all saw more than once. Anyway, in a time when all the giants of the world, its great powers, recognized it very quickly. So much that for a country like America, President Harry Truman recognized Israel after only 11 minutes. The very next day, on May the 15th, 1948, Arab armies would announce going to war, and the New York Times published a headline of "Jews in Grave Danger in All Muslim Lands." If you reflected on that title, it takes advantage of the Holocaust. It was a rising state with a ready-to-go propaganda. One day after it was announced, one of the biggest newspapers published such title. And while the headline implies a Jewish minority facing a huge tide of Muslims, if we look a bit closer, we would find that the entire 7 Arab armies were very small in number. They had only around 25,000 soldiers. Let me remind you that these armies weren't as regular as we think. These were armies of countries that some of them were still under occupation. On the other side, the Jewish army started the war with 35,000 soldiers. By the end of the war, they became 100,000 soldiers. Anyone who hasn't watched the episode might think that the Arab countries were regular armies that lost in front of a group of gangs. However, after watching this entire episode, now you know that these weren't just some gangs. These groups were trained by the British, participated in World War II, have been in operations, have funding, have been fighting for years, and were handed fully weaponized military camps by the Western countries. In addition to that, Arab armies still had the idea these were just gangs and didn't consider all the other factors. That's why Arabs were shocked by defeat. How was a group of regular armies defeated by a bunch of gangs? But like we have said, they weren't just gangs. They were armed forces who did massacres during war, like bombing Lyd and Ramla and the Tantura massacre that we talked about. According to Ilan Pappé, massacres were no longer committed when there was a need or even as a part of a certain strategy. They took place simply for the sake of them happening, or as Pappé described, Zionists can no longer see that they are killing humans. In August 1948, after the defeat of the Arab armies and expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees to surrounding countries, Count Bernadotte, the UN ambassador, visited Palestine and refugee camps in Jordan. He was terrified by what he saw. He said, "It would be an insult to the principles of justice to deprive these innocent victims of the right to return to their homes." Yes, finally the UN talks, the international law. Unfortunately, a plot twist, the Count will die. The Stern gang assassinated him with the participation of Yitzhak Shamir, who will become, as usual, the Prime Minister of Israel. It's like a requirement for the position. By December 1948, the Jews will occupy 85% of Jerusalem outside the Old City in front of the eyes of the UN. The Israeli historian Hillel Cohen said that thousands of refugees from Sepphoris and the surrounding villages took shelter in the Christian city of Nazareth, which Ben-Gurion feared of destroying, knowing its importance in the Christian world. It's the city of Jesus. Thanks, I guess. These thousands of refugees made a nucleus for the 1948. Arabs, the Palestinians inside the new state to be established. The Jewish Zionist gangs tried to attract the Christians of villages like Al-Bassa to return, but without the Muslims. Why? To establish the existence of safe Christian villages and affirm that they were in a defensive war with the Muslim Arabs. But the Palestinian Christians of Al-Bassa refused to return without the Palestinian Muslims. On December 11th, the UN issued Resolution 1904 guaranteeing the right of return for every refugee who was expelled. How many refugees were they? How many were expelled in the Nakba? 750,000 refugees, and that was in 1948. 75 years later, the refugees' number went up to 5 million refugees. The Argentinian researcher Pedro Briga, during his visit to refugee camps decades after the Nakba, found that all children introduced themselves with names of the villages that their ancestors were expelled from. This child knows nothing about the village except its name. He never visited nor saw it, yet still calls himself after its name. He still has the key of his grandparents' house that they were kicked from. Generations would still pass on these keys, one to another. The right of return that the UN granted the Palestinians in 1949, as you know, was never implemented. But on the other hand, in 1950, Israel announced the legendary right of return, that any Jew has the right to return to Israel. Israel, that represents the extension of the Jewish state after the Roman invasion in 70 BC, 2,000 years ago. It's actually ironic. Why would someone who never lived on this land has the right to return to it, while someone who actually lived on the land doesn't have the right to return? The only condition for Israel's return law is to have a Jewish mother. Imagine a Jewish Russian. His grandparents for 20 generations lived, died, and got buried in Russia. He would get the right to return, go to Israel, get the citizenship, a passport, and all his rights once he steps off that plane. On the other hand, at the West Bank, there's the Jordan River that has Palestine to its left and Jordan to its right. There's a Palestinian refugee in Jordan standing on the side of the river looking at Palestine's land on the other side, his and his grandparents' land, but can't cross the river to it. The law of return of the Jews is a culmination of a Herzl-originated idea, freeing the Jews from all their diaspora and creating a pure race society, a society just for them. They create its boundaries and cancel the others, whether by avoidance, expulsion, or genocide. By the time of the peace treaty in July 1949, the Zionist forces didn't just take over 55% of the land according to the partition resolution. No, they took 78% from the land. The UN acknowledged these new borders and called them the Green Line. The Israeli historian Theodor Katz, whom we spoke of early on, the one with the masters in Tantura, said that the morality of the IDF lives on an eternal fallacy because they didn't come to a land without people, but to a land with 1.3 million Palestinians there. But they weren't humans in the eyes of the Israeli army. This is probably the way that new generations in Israel will inherit the fictional legend. A group of psychological defense mechanisms, denial and justification, to help them sleep at night and forget that buried in this land just a meter down, all the possible evidence on the killing, genocide and ethnic cleansing. What happened in Tantura happened in all Palestinian land. Last the only democracy in the Middle East. In the Middle East in 1948, Ben-Gurion, the immigrant who spent his youth in Poland, said that not only did he achieve the dream, but he's also its founder, or how the Jews named him, the state's main founder. A dream described as a 100% Jewish country without Arabs, a completely pure society for Jews only. And if any Palestinian tried to disturb the dream, he would face the fate of Jerusalem and Haifa, destroyed villages, ports bombed off, streets filled with thousands of Palestinian corpses. Those who were lucky were expelled and lived as refugees all their lives. The slogan raised by the Zionist movement, "A land without a people for a people without a land," for the entirety of our tale was an absolute slogan that doesn't accept bargaining or any presence of the other. It's either us or them. A slogan that the Zionists adhered to even when Arabs represented 70% of the population and 90% of the land. 75 years after Ben-Gurion's declaring the achievement of the dream, the Jewish community still maintains its purity equation no matter the consequence. The community includes Israeli Jews, who have the privileges, and Palestinians who suffer from discrimination on all levels. A society summed up by its current leader, Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people. And only it. If you are an Arab living on the historical land of Palestine, your life will be determined early on by where you are, which is partitioned into three categories: the 48 Palestinians, West Bank Palestinians, and Palestinians of Gaza. The 48 Palestinians are 2 million Palestinians with the Israeli citizenship. They alone constitute 20% of the country, but they are second-class citizens. 1948. Palestinians get fewer years of education than their fellow Israeli citizens because the Arabic spoken by those 2 million Palestinians is not officially recognized. No matter how high of a rank they get at work, their monthly income stays less than the average Israeli citizen. If they decided, it doesn't matter, I'll focus only on my life and my family. Unfortunately, they aren't allowed to request citizenship for their families living outside Israel. Even if they decided to forget all about their origin and become Jewish, according to the Israeli law, they're not allowed to do that, or at least they'll face many obstacles to make sure it's nearly impossible. A hard life, huh? Let me tell you that this is considered a luckier life than Palestinians in the West Bank. There are 2.7 million Palestinians living in the West Bank under the direct Israeli occupation. But they live in a prison-like structure, with sectors of locked gates, and moving from a sector or a prison to another requires passing through numerous military checkpoints. On the one street you live in, there could be tens of checkpoints, turning a 5-minute walk to an hours-long inspection. With all that, you're surrounded by more than 130 settlements, illegal of course. These settlements are housed by 500,000 settlers. Between 2017 and 2021, the Israeli army gave 33 permits for the Palestinians to build houses, while on the other hand, the Israeli army demolished over 1,150 homes and gave the illegal settlers 1,100 building permits. The Palestinian whose home is demolished with nowhere to go can't even put up a tent without getting a permit from the Israeli army that he certainly doesn't get. Where do we go? We don't know, figure it out. They really tightened the tap on them. The truth is, they didn't just tighten it metaphorically, they did it literally. Water, which is a basic right for any human, gets delivered to the settler with a capacity of 300 litres per day, while the Palestinian waits for water to fill his tank every 15 days from the Israeli government and companies. And his daily capacity doesn't exceed 80 litres per day, which is less than the 100 litres per day, which is less than the 100 litres specified by the World Health Organization. That's not a water shortage, but an intended discrimination in distribution between the Palestinian and Israeli. If you live in Gaza, your response would be, wait, you guys have water? In Gaza, 2 million people live on an area of 360 km2, no barriers, no gates, as the entire strip is fully besieged. It is not connected to the world by a port, an airport, or even a train. Nothing can get in or out without permission of the Israeli army. Some sources say that the Israeli army controls the amount of calories that enter to the citizens inside the strip. They calculate the amount of food entering to the number of people for the calories intake. Most of the strip's land is not suitable for farming. Its groundwater is polluted. 90% of it is not suitable for human consumption or even to grow food. 80% of the population's food depends on international aid. There's not even constant electricity to help you see the wretched conditions. Gaza's need for electricity is 500 megawatts, and it only receives no more than 200 megawatts. In an environment like this, the unemployment rate stands at 50%. Although children make up the majority of the population in Gaza, most of the strip schools were destroyed. Even though Israel doesn't militarily occupy Gaza, it turned it into a large open-air prison, whose key is only in the hands of Israel. The International Committee of the Red Cross considers the situation to be a complete violation of the Geneva Conventions. According to the Israeli academic Oren Yiftachel, Israel is an ethnocracy, a country that only serves Jews, a system that works for the Jewish majority with the goal to harm the Arab minority. A system to confirm its purity and identity. This won't happen without inflicting severe damage to others living with it. Israel is an apartheid state. These aren't only my or your words, but those of Noam Chomsky, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Israeli Minister of Education himself. Israel is an apartheid state. Or what I said throughout the episode since Zionism was just an idea, until this moment here and now, says that apartheid is the expected development of the original idea, that identity will determine people's rights, and that because of the Palestinians' identity, they'd be robbed of their rights. A world that we wish would end soon, and that Palestinians would get their rights as humans and Palestinians. And in the end, we tried together to understand the roots of this reality, and understand how the story originated, developed, and got complexed. Maybe when we understand this dreadful reality, we'd have the imagination to paint a picture of a better reality. That's what makes us human at the end. And my last word, the real animals is not the Palestinians. The real animals is the Israeli, and treat them from now on accordingly all over the world. And in the end, as YouTube, have a lot of problems with this content, and I kicked out from my job as an old man for saying the truth like any journalist. So if you can help us to fund this content, to make it stand out and go among the people. I search so deep about the truths that will help you to see the right image of your history, not what the media and the Israeli narratives try to convince with. See you next video.